Good afternoon. First off, I'd like to start off by saying thank you, Representative Newton, for having me here and to be a part of the Rotary Club today. It's quite an honor. I'd also like to say thank you to my family for being here, especially my grandmother Joy, which means a lot for her to be here, to me. And I'd also like to say that my mom, Kitty Terry, formerly Kitty Hancock, wanted to be here desperately, but is sick at the moment. So I wanted to send out just a nice word to her and wish she could have been here, but she would have liked to see everybody. I'd like to start off by telling a little bit about my background, and then talk a little bit about going to Sierra Leone this past May and June, and then a little bit about the research, the public health research that we were trying to conduct there. And then at the end, if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer any questions. So, as Representative Newton said, I grew up in Montgomery, Alabama. I went to Trinity High School. After leaving Trinity, I attended the University of Alabama, and I was a history major at the University of Alabama. And I thought when I started at the university that, like a lot of people in my family, they were history majors. I was going to go to law school, and that was going to be the road, and a history degree was perfect for that. And then my junior year, I was at the Ferguson Center having dinner, and saw a sign up for Peace Corps. And I'd heard of Peace Corps. I knew it was this idea that was out there that was doing good work in a lot of places like Africa and Latin America. And so I thought, I've got time. So I went later that night to the auditorium where they're having the meeting. And I walked in, and there was 3 people in the huge auditorium for a couple thousand, and a nice lady setting up her projector and ready to have a speech. And I remember walking in and saying, maybe this isn't, I'm not supposed to be here. And I was turning to leave, and the woman said, no, you're in the right place. We're about to get started. We've got coffee and cookies, so coffee and cookies, I can stay for that. And we sat through, she gave a great presentation. The woman that gave that presentation for the Peace Corps ended up being the woman that gave me my pen and signed me up and approved me to go to Kenya in the Peace Corps. So a small effort on my part to go that night turned into something that would end up changing my life in a big way. After graduating from the University of Alabama in 2006, there was a little bit of interim period before I was finally found a placement for Peace Corps. And then early in 2007, I left for Kenya, Africa, to be a public health volunteer for 2 years. This experience was my first. I had been to Europe a couple times, but this was my first real experience with the third world or the developing world, and kind of seeing how a large majority of the world lives. I loved my time in Kenya. There were ups and downs. There was a lot of good things, a lot of bad things, but I would not have traded that experience for anything in the world. It gave me the opportunity to talk to kids about public health issues such as safe sex, HIV and AIDS, and just be a mentor and talk about, they wanted to talk about different things health-wise that maybe were not something they discussed in school or with their families. That gave them another opportunity to do that. Probably my favorite thing that I did while I was there was I started a youth soccer team, and the kids love soccer over there. It's their passion. And my one requirement was I'll set up the field, I'll get everyone set up to play a team, and we'll make sure a time for it, but you have to listen to me for 20 minutes talk about health. And so they said, okay, that's not too bad of a requirement. I also had the opportunity while I was in Kenya to learn a little of their culture, and as much as a Peace Corps volunteer we exchange about being an American and about our lifestyle, they also give back to us about their lifestyle, which was really special to me. Got to learn a little Swahili while I was there as well, which is pretty rusty now, but was a lot of fun to mess around with in the village I was. For context, I was in a small village, maybe 45 minutes outside of Nairobi, their big city of 5 or 6 million. So I would go to the city quite often to have a shower or watch a movie, get coffee, these kind of things. Small little things. After Peace Corps, I moved to Washington, D.C., where I worked for a couple different international development organizations. Some focused on public health, some on development that did with farming or agriculture or governance or stability, not necessarily health. Loved my time in Washington. I was in Washington, D.C. for about 3.5 years working. I was supporting projects internationally, but I wasn't actually working internationally. I was at the home base there, getting logistical support, administrative support for the people working in the field. An opportunity came up 2 years ago to take a short-term assignment in Afghanistan, and I jumped on the opportunity, which I don't think I told my dad right away about that, or my mom for that matter. But I not only wanted to do, I didn't want to be involved just from the domestic side. I wanted to actually get my hands dirty and participate. And so enjoyed my time in Afghanistan. I was there closing down a 5-year stability project that had been going on, and it was coming to an end, and so they needed people to help with the logistics and operation of getting rid of all the equipment, of getting the people that had worked, the local Afghans who'd been working on the project to new companies, to new jobs. So I helped with that facilitation. Really interesting experience being in Afghanistan, Central Asia. Definitely one of the weirdest places I've ever been. After Afghanistan, I was back in Washington, and I was thinking that instead of doing a short term, or instead of working domestically, I really wanted to work internationally in health, and so I knew I needed to go back to get a higher education. So luckily I was accepted to the University of Edinburgh, where Charles's daughter's husband is a PhD student, and Lila and Steve live in Edinburgh, so I had an Alabama connection going there, which was fantastic. I got my master's in public health at the University of Edinburgh this past month in August, and it was a really great experience. It was a 1-year program. It was an accelerated master's program, but it was pretty fantastic. Towards the end of that, I needed to write a master's thesis or a dissertation, and luckily my supervisor was a wonderful woman that I had a great class with. The best supervisor I could have asked for, and we were kind of brainstorming ideas. What do you want to do? I said I wanted to do something on Africa. I was thinking maybe going back to Kenya, because that's what I knew. She said, well, let me make a call. And she had a church friend who runs a small environmental NGO in Edinburgh, and they work in Africa, they work in Asia. And so she set up a meeting. I went and met with them, and that's how I ended up. They had a project they were interested in finding out about in Sierra Leone. They're currently working in Sierra Leone. They wanted to find out about some public health issues going on in the area they're working. And so we had a meeting. It worked out very well, and had the opportunity to travel down to Sierra Leone in West Africa, which I had no experience with, and did not really know what to expect there. And it turned out to be a really amazing experience. I was there 5 weeks. 4 weeks of that, a month, was in the countryside, the rural part of the northern part of the country. And then a week in Freetown, the capital, doing administrative matters, meeting with people that were working on the project. So that's a little bit about my background and kind of how I got to Sierra Leone. And I briefly wanted to talk a little bit about Sierra Leone as a country, to give context to where we were, to where I was, and then a little bit about the research that I was doing there. Sierra Leone is a West African country. If you think about the west coast of Africa and it starts to drop off the hump and you're getting into Central Africa, it's right under there, kind of hidden underneath. It's a small country of 5 million people, roughly the size of Alabama, and it's roughly, geography-wise, the size of Alabama as well. As many of you know, they've experienced a terrible civil war that started in the early 1990s and recently ended in the mid-2000s, which ravaged the country. They're doing better now, and they're having, just like we're having our election in November, they're also having their presidential election in November as well. And so, very optimistic about this. They say for a true democracy, you have to have turnover, and power has to go 2 or 3 times over for it to be a true democracy. This will be their second turn at that. So, if they've had a president, they've elected a new president, this will be their 3rd time at it. So, I'm really optimistic they can keep that up. To give a little bit of context on Sierra Leone and not really knowing much about West Africa before going, I'd been a Peace Corps volunteer in Kenya, as I mentioned, and I was shocked by how greater the poverty level and the bleakness of that country. The people are wonderful, very, very hospitable, but when I say compared to Kenya, how much poverty, there were parts where I went, there was no health centers, no hospitals, no roads, no electricity, no running water, very little clothing for the children, and something interesting I've learned in my time going to Africa is that without heating or insulated buildings, it gets really cold there, which you'd never think in Africa it would get cold. And even in a country like Sierra Leone on the equator, one of the coldest places I've ever been. So they definitely have some issues there. But met some incredible people, and the people there are great, even though they don't have a lot. They still a deeply religious country, deeply care about their neighbors, care about their family, and that came across very strongly. Talk a little bit about the research I was doing there. So this environmental NGO, this environmental organization in Edinburgh was working in Sierra Leone. They were doing forest management, and what that means basically is that they were going into communities that had rainforest and giving them incentives not to tear it down or burn it down for farmland. And so they're trying to work with the local citizens to keep their forest maintained, because their forests were unbelievably beautiful. They had incredible flora and fauna there, elephants, hippos, monkeys, gorillas, everything you can imagine. And so they're trying to work with the local citizens to keep their forests up. The reason they brought me in is they wanted to also, and not just work with the forest management, they wanted to work on the public health there. And kind of what Charles touched on, they wanted to increase well digging, they wanted to build latrines, they wanted to increase access to medication, malaria bed nets, improve roads. During the rainy season, the roads become impassable. And something that really stuck out to me while I was there, I've been to half a dozen countries in Africa, and this was the first place I went where they didn't have Coca-Cola. It was so remote. You couldn't get a Coke, not a hot Coke, not a Coke at all. And I think that's an indication of how remote and poor they were. The three main health issues that I discovered while I was there, not discovered, but we investigated, was access to clean drinking water, access to medication was a big thing, and malaria. And so at the end of my 4 weeks there, I went back to Freetown. I wrote a report for BioClimate, the company I was working for, to tell them about these issues. And then I also turned that into a larger report that I turned into my master's thesis. So it was kind of a dual process there. And I did that through interviews with local citizens, chiefs of the villages, doctors at the local hospitals, if they may be in a regional area. We would go out, me and two interpreters, two Sierra Leonean interpreters, and kind of our handler, this guy named Momo, Gabisi Momo, who is, I thanked him in my dissertation that said this would not have been possible without this man. He's just incredibly a spiritual man and one of those guys that just gets things done. And so we went out each day on a motorbike because the roads were so bad, and went to a different village and interviewed people about their health and asked, what are your big issues? What is it, if you could have anything fixed here, what would it be? And that's what those were the three things: clean water, access to medicine, and malaria, that were the major issues. So we reported that back. It was an incredible experience, 5 weeks being there, and I was just telling Representative Newton that potentially there's an opportunity to go back to Sierra Leone. The research that we found and we submitted to the company that submitted it to get funding might lead to them actually getting some grant money, and then they can implement some of the things that we wrote about in this report: building of wells, building of latrines, more access to medicine for families, maybe some road construction. I'd like to end my speech by just saying that my mom, Kitty, really wanted to be here, and she showed me a letter that I'd written her, my first letter I'd written her from Kenya when I was in the Peace Corps, and I read it before talking today, and it basically, I wrote her and said that what I'm doing, going to Africa or going to these different places, is nothing special. I think anyone can do it. It's just a matter of trying to put yourself in in that position and get out there and really take a chance. And I think anyone, I don't think anything I've done is going to Sierra Leone or going to Afghanistan or Kenya is anything that special. I think anyone can do it, but it's just a matter of doing it. So thank you very much for hearing me, and if there's any question, I'd be happy to answer any. So,
What do you do?
I'm waiting to hear about the job in Sierra Leone. So if I'm...
Were any of those places scary?
They're all scary. I was telling my dad a story. He was asking me. He said, "Why would you want to go back to Sierra Leone?" Or something like that. And I said, "I've been to Kenya. I've been to Afghanistan. I've been to Sierra Leone, Peru, South Africa, a bunch of countries in Europe. And the only place I've ever had any trouble is in Washington D.C."
Wow.
So yeah.
Well, I have a question about the wells, and it relates to public health. Someone, a friend of mine that has been all over Africa, said that people go and they punch wells in the ground, and it's wonderful, except that then the transmission of that water to other parts of a village or a community or whatever doesn't occur, and people, and they, lots of times they self-govern themselves, and eventually the village moves to and surrounds the well, and
Right.
then the next challenge is that they bring their animals, instead of moving the water off, they bring their animals there, and so then they have a larger health problem. Is that fact? I mean, have they?
That's pretty accurate. I mean, most of the villages, I visited 47 villages in 27 days, and roughly the size of 100 people to 5,000 people. And a big issue is contamination. You know, they'll have a well that maybe was built 20 years ago. Pump doesn't work. They have to drop a bucket down, which can lead, then the wood could be infected. Animals come by, they drop their feces. This is a huge issue. The way we wanted to do it is, I think, the proper way, which is a cemented well covered with a pump, and something that'll last 20 to 30 years, because it is a huge issue of contamination. But a well that's cemented, pumped, and borehole deep enough to get to the groundwater is roughly about $10,000 US. So to do it properly and to do it correct, that'll last. It's expensive. But a lot of these communities I went to were digging in marshes or swamps, just 2 or 3 feet down to get water, river water. And there was one village we visited that was right on the Guinea border, that they had their water imported from Guinea because their water was so terrible. A lot of communities will get their water in a big bucket and put it down, let it sit for an hour until all the sediment drops to the bottom, and then scoop off the top. So definitely, as I mentioned, the 3 top issues. I mean, access to clean drinking water is the biggest thing. It's paramount. It's life, water. So.
Charles,
Yes, ma'am.
tell them about how you got out of Kenya when they sent you home.
So my Peace Corps experience wasn't all great. This was back in December of 2007, they had presidential elections of their own, and Kenya is, at the time before this election, was the country on the hill, the shining light of Africa, the democracy, and have done great, and they had some of the bloodiest and violent presidential election because they felt like the guy that won, they fixed the election. So this was right around Christmas time. I was with some other of my Peace Corps friends. We were out in a remote area in the western part of Kenya, and this happened, and there's a lot of violence, a lot of killings. So Peace Corps ended up flying us a private jet out of Kenya to Tanzania, to Dar es Salaam, the major city in Tanzania, where we spent a month on the beach with everything paid for, while Kenya was experiencing all this terrible stuff we're over here, which wasn't too bad. But then things settled down and we went back. But then things flared up again, and we eventually they had to shut down the Peace Corps program in Kenya. So my service, your Peace Corps service is supposed to be 2 years. Mine ended up being about 15, 16 months. But it was scary, but Peace Corps and the U.S. government took care of us very well.
Miss Daisy wants to know if you ever got shot at.
Yeah, I wanna know that.
Only in Alabama. only growing up in Montgomery, maybe. Friends. Never in any of my travels now. Yes, sir.
Is Sierra Leone completely an agricultural type of country, or how do they?
The majority of their citizens are farmers, but the country is one of the strongest wealths of diamonds, gold. They just discovered, someone was telling me when I was there, cobalt, which is the mineral they put in all the cell phones, which they have. Their problem is not, and they have beautiful beaches. It's tons of natural resources, good soil. Their problem is not their resource. Their problem is their governance and corruption and their leaders. That the 1% of the country has everything, and 99% is living with nothing. I think I saw something on the United Nations Development Program Index that Sierra Leone was 187 out of 187 countries in quality of life, and that's North Korea, Afghanistan, Iran in front of them.
Good.
So there's no trickle down, and there's not a lot of education opportunities, so most people are farmers, because that's all they can do. Yes, ma'am.
The Carter Center has been working for years on clean water, and because of the guinea worm, do these people over there have the guinea worm? That just sounded awful to me.
They do. It's getting better. They do. One good thing about the Sierra Leone government is they're actually doing. In 2010, they instituted free universal health care for pregnant and lactating mothers and children under 5. It's not always enforced, but they do vaccines for the guinea worm, or they have availability, because it affects children a lot because they're running around barefoot. The major problem they have there, other than guinea worm, is they have this tsetse fly, this black fly that lays its eggs in fast-moving water in a river, and it causes blindness. And there wasn't a village 47 villages that I visited, there wasn't not having a case of river blindness in there. And that was a huge thing, even more than guinea worm, but they do have that. Diarrhea, there's an outbreak of cholera, if you can believe that. It's been eradicated here we haven't had a case here for 150 years. It's intestinal stuff because it all comes back to water. And the water that they're putting in their bodies is making them sick.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So everything that you do is just so great, but it fits the road with what we do.
I really appreciate it. It's nice.
Yeah, thank you.
Did you ask him, could you go with him?
I'm trying to give you a shot.
Thank y'all.
Matter of fact, for those Auburn comments, absolutely.
Good to have y'all with us. How are you? We enjoyed that. Yeah. Nice to see you.